Good morning, students. Welcome to our lecture, which is belonging to classical and modern literature. So, this is our third lesson, this third lecture, and in this lecture, we mainly point out Renaissance drama and poetry, also the golden age of English literature. In this lecture, we will deeply understand about Renaissance drama and poetry. The first is literature. When we golden age, we mainly imagine that Elizabeth was first, because Elizabethan age, which is belonged to the golden age of English literature. So we mainly call golden age as the Elizabethan age. And in this time, Shakespeare's work was the most popular works in the English literature. So, a golden age of English literature commenced in 1485 and lasted until 1660. Malory Lemaster was among the first works to be printed by William Caxton, who introduced the printing press to England in 1476. From that time on, readership was vastly multiplied. Because of middle class, the continuing development of trade, the new character and thoroughness of education for lay people and not only clergy, the centralization of power and of much intellectual life in the court of the Tudor and Stuart monarchs and the widening horizons of exploration gave fundamental new impetus and direction to literature. The English part of the European movement known as Humanism also belongs to this time. Humanism encouraged greater care in the study of literature of classical antiquity and reformed education in such a way as to make literary expression of paramount importance for the cultured person. And, his work was so famous. His Latin prose narrative Utopia satirizes the rationale of inherited assumption about private property and money and follows Plato in deploring the failure of kings to make use of wisdom of philosophers. Mor's book describes a distant nation organized to purely reasonable principles and enabled Utopia. In Greek language, it means nowhere. Here given is a book of Sir Thomas More. It's a Utopia, and it's a photo of Sir Thomas More. According to the Renaissance poetry, have some information. That is, the poetry of the earlier part of the 16th century is generally less important, with the exception of the work of John Skelton, which exhibits a curious combination of medieval and Renaissance influences. In this period of time, Sir Philip Sidney and Edmund Spenser's work was very popular among this period. It is a book of Sir Philip Sidney, which called Astrophel and Stella. Sidney, universally recognized as a model of Renaissance nobleman, outwardly polished as well as inwardly conscientious, inaugurate the vogue of the sonnet cycle in his Astrophel and Stella. This work, have written in 1582 and it published 1591. In this work, in the elaborate and highly metaphorical style of earlier Italian sonnet, he celebrated his idealized love for Penelope Devereux, the daughter of Walter Devereux, first Earl of Essex. These lyrics profess to say in her an ideal for womanhood that in the Platonic manner leads to perception of good, the true and the beautiful, and consequently of the divine. This idealization of the beloved remained a favorite motif in much of the poetry and the drama of the late 16th century. It had its roots not only in Platonism but also in the Platonic speculations. In this picture given that Astrophil and Stella's edition, which is published in 1627. According to the Edmund Spenser's work, he had written the fairy queen, the greatest monument to the idealism broadened to include all features of moral life is Spenser's uncompleted fairy queen, the most famous work of the period. In each of these completed 6 books, it depicts the activities of a hero that point towards the ideal form of particular virtue. At the same time, it looks forward to marriage of Arthur, who is a combination of all the virtues, and Glorina, who is the ideal form of womanhood and the embodiment of Queen Elizabeth. It is entirely typical of the impulse of the Renaissance in England that in his work Spenser tried to cut out of the inherited English elements of Assyrian romance and an archaic partly medieval style or a noble epic that would make a national literature the equal of those of ancient Greece and Rome and of Renaissance Italy. In a number of other lyrical and narrative works, Sidney and Spenser displayed the ornate, somewhat florid, highly figurative style characteristic of a great deal of Elizabethan poetic expression. But two other poetic tendencies became visible toward in the end of the 16th and in the early part of the 17th centuries. Here given John Donne's photo, who belonged to this period, to the Renaissance poetry. First tendency is amplified by the poetry of John Donne and the other so-called metaphysical poets, which carried the metaphorical style to heights of daring, complexity, and ingenuity. Among the most important of Donne's followers, George Herbert is distinguished for his carefully constructed religious lyrics, which strive to express with personal humanity the emotions appropriate to all true Christians. Here given photos of representatives of Renaissance period. The second late Renaissance poetic tendency was in reaction to the sometimes flamboyant lushness of the Spenserians and to the sometimes tortuous verbal gymnastics of the metaphysical poets, best represented by the accomplished poetry Ben Jonson and his school. It reveals a classically pure and restrained style that had strong influence on the late figures such as Robert Herrick. and the other cavalier poets, and gives the direction for the poetic development of the succeeding neoclassical period. The last great poet of English Renaissance was the Puritan writer John Milton. City and the poet narrated in Paradise Lost. The machinations of Satan leading to fall of Adam and Eve from the state innocence, and he performed the task in such a way as to justify the ways of God to man, and to express the central Christian truths of freedom, sin, and redemption as he conceived them. The Renaissance drama and the prose period was longest between 16th and 17th century. The poetry of English Renaissance between 1580 and 1660 was the result of remarkable outbursts of energy. It is, however, the drama of roughly and the same period that stands highest in popular estimation. The works of its greatest representative, William Shakespeare, have achieved worldwide renown. Renaissance drama proper rose from this late medieval base by a number of transitional stages ending about 1580. A large number of comedies, tragedies, and examples of intermediate types were produced for London theatres between that year and 1642, when the London theatres were closed by order of Puritan Parliament. Only the Roman tragedian Lucius Annaeus Seneca could provide a model for the earliest popular tragedy of blood and revenge. A few years later, Christopher Marlowe in the tragedies Tamburlaine the Great, Part 1, Edward II, began the tradition of the chronicle play of the fatal deeds of kings and the potent. Marlowe's plays, such as the tragical history of Dr. Faustus and the Jew of Malta, are remarkable primarily for their daring depictions of world-shattering characters who strive to get beyond their normal human limitations as the Christian medieval ethos had conceived them. These works are written in the poetic style, worthy in many ways of comparison to Shakespeare's. Now we will know about Shakespeare's works, Shakespeare's sonnets. Before start about Shakespeare's works, I would like to show you a video about biography of Shakespeare.
William Shakespeare. He is widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language and the world's preeminent dramatist. He is often called England's national poet and nicknamed the Bard of Avon. He was born in 23 April, 1564, in Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire, England. His father's name was John Shakespeare, and mother's name was Mary Arden. His father was a successful local businessman, and mother was the daughter of a landowner. Shakespeare was the third son of his parents. He was baptized on April 26, 1564. Little is known of Shakespeare's childhood and education. It is speculated that he attended the King's New School in Stratford, where he learned to read and write. Since all the grammar schools then followed the same curricula, it is believed that He received intensive education in grammar based upon Latin classical authors. Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway at the age of 18 in 1582. She was 8 years older than him. They had 3 children. They are Susanna Hall, Hamnet Shakespeare, and Judith Quiney. William Shakespeare has been conferred with the honor of being England's national poet and Bard of Avon. Though it's not exactly known as to when did Shakespeare begin his writing career, records of performances show that his plays started to feature on the London stage by 1592. Scholars refer to the years between 1585 and 1592 as Shakespeare's lost years. In 1592, London theatre scene, Shakespeare's writings were called as rubbish by another playwright. Afterwards, the same playwright documented his biography. Shakespeare's play were solely performed by Lord Chamberlain Company in 1594, of which Shakespeare himself was one of the actors. After the Queen Elizabeth died, the new King James I issued a royal patent to the company, and it was renamed as The King's Men. In 1598, William Shakespeare's name appeared on the title page of the work. By 1599, Shakespeare's work were famous all over the globe. He continued writing until at least 1613. He wrote 38 dramas, 154 sonnet, 2 long poem. His best work was Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Macbeth, etc. Talking about the style that Shakespeare adopted for his work, he was extremely innovative. He adapted the traditional and convention style in his own way by adding metaphors and rhetorical phrases. However, the additions hardly ever align to the plot or the characters of this story. He died on 23 April, 1616, at the age of 52 at his hometown. He died within a month of signing his will, a document which he begins by describing himself as being in perfect health. In his will, Shakespeare left the bulk of his large estate to his elder daughter Susanna. "All that glitters is not gold," said William Shakespeare.
About his life, Shakespeare's biography. I think you understood about Shakespeare's life. According to the Shakespeare sonnets are often breathtaking, sometimes disturbing and sometimes puzzling and elusive in their meaning. Before start Shakespeare sonnets, I would like to follow information about what is a sonnets.
Hi everyone! Today we are looking at the topic, what is a sonnet? Let's start with its definition. A sonnet is a poem of 14 lines using any of a number of formal rhyme schemes. In English, typically having 10 syllables per line. When we say 10 syllables per line, we're actually talking about the use of the iambic pentameter, such as in the line, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun," which is the first line out of Shakespeare's Sonnet 130. There are 2 main types of sonnets in general. You've got the Petrarchan sonnet, which is of Italian origins, and the Shakespearean sonnet, which is of English origins. Let's take a look at the structure of each type. In the Petrarchan sonnet, you've got an octave and a sestet, with the volta usually placed between the octave and the sestet. With the Shakespearean sonnet, it's made up of 3 quatrains and a couplet, with the volta's placement being a bit more flexible and could come at any point after the midsection of a poem. Moving on to the rhyme scheme. In the Petrarchan sonnet, you would see ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE, or CDC, DCD, which is basically a combination of envelope rhymes and triple rhymes. In the Shakespearean sonnet, you would see ABAB, CDCD, EFEFGG, which is a combination of alternate rhymes and a rhyming couplet. For more information and study tips on English literature, check out my blog www.hyperbolite.com. See you there.
Okay, let's start Shakespeare's sonnets. I would like to give you information about Shakespeare's sonnets. As sonnets, their main concern is love, but they also reflect upon time, change, aging, lust, absence, infidelity, and the problematic gap between ideal and the reality when it comes to the person you love. Even after 400 years, that what is Shakespeare's sonnets about and how are we to read them are still central and unresolved questions. According to our lecture, we will learn about 2 sonnets of Shakespeare's. The first is the fair use sonnets. Sonnets 1 to 126 seem to be addressed to a young man, socially superior to the speaker. The first 17 sonnets encourage this youth to marry and father children because otherwise and his choose and beauty's doom and date. In a sonnet 14, that is, his beauty will die with him. After this, the sonnets diversify in their subjects. Some erotically celebrate the master or mistress of my passion, while others reflect upon the lovely boy as a cause of anguish, as the speaker desperately wishes for his behavior to be different to the cruelty that is sometimes is. For if you were by my unkindness shaken as I might by yours, the speaker of sonnet 100 time. This ways this information is about Shakespeare's fairy use sonnet. And the second sonnet is the Jack Lady. According to this sonnet, there are some information. Sonnets 127 to 152 seem to be addressed to a woman, the so-called Jack Lady of Shakespearean legend. This woman is elusive, often tyrannous, and causes the speaker great pain and shame. Many of the sonnets reflect on the paradox of the fair lady's dark complexion, as sonnet 127 punningly puts it. Black was not considered fair in Shakespeare's era, which favored fair hair and light complexions. This woman's eyes and hair are raven black, and yet the speaker finds her most alluring. The 2 final sonnets in 154 focus on the classical god Cupid and playfully detail desire and longing. They don't seem to directly relate to the rest of collection. Now I will give information about Shakespeare's sonnets when were composed and published. Sonnets were probably written and perhaps revised between the early 1590s and about 1650s. Versions of sonnets 128 and 144 were printed in the poetry collection The Passionate Pilgrim in 1599. Previously, we have learned about the ages of mid. There were three ages: the Elizabethan age, Jacobean age, and the Caroline age. What you know about Elizabethan age? Why do we call it as the Elizabethan age? Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII, became the Queen of England at the age of 25. It was a time of English Renaissance. Elizabethan age is often called the Golden Age of England on the grounds that art, music, poetry, and drama flourished. Elizabethan age was introduced by prose, which developed in several very different forms. One kind of style was used at court of ladies. That style was very artificial, but it was necessary for every young lady to know not only French but also euphuism. Euphuism was a fashionable manner of speech. The sentence was complicated and long, and while speaking, the speaker often forgets the main idea of his utterance. The style was filled with alliteration and malice, behind which the reader forgets the thought. The word euphuism came from John Lyly's novel. Euphus started a fashion which spread in conversation as well as in books. Queen Elizabeth also used it in her speeches. The second work in this age is the life of Jack Wilton. This work have written by Thomas Nash, the story about men of bad character. And the third prose is essays. These essays quoted by Francis Bacon. It happened in 1597. The sentences in essays are short and laconic. All colors will agree in the dark, or revenge is a kind of real justice. Some of sentences from the essays became the famous sayings: a wise man will make more opportunities than he finds. The second in Middle English period is Jacobean age or Jacobean era. Jacobean era was a time when James VI was king of England. James I ruled between 1603 and 1625. The time is called Jacobean age and era because Jacobus is the Latin version of the name James. Jacobean art, the culture was heavily influenced by the art and the culture of the Elizabethan age. The Caroline age is named after Charles I. Caroline is an adjective of Carolus, the Latin word of Charles. The age of Caroline is an age of poetry of three kinds of schools: metaphysical, cavalry, and Puritan schools of poetry. The next period is Commonwealth period. The Commonwealth was a political structure during the period from 1649 to 1660, when England and Wales, later along with Ireland and Scotland, were governed as a republic after the end of the Second English Civil War and the trial and the execution of Charles I. The Commonwealth period is better remembered for the military sector, Fairfax, Oliver Cromwell, and the New Model Army. According to today's lecture, we have given two authors according to the Renaissance period. First is John Bunyan, and the second one John Dryden. John Bunyan was the author of the most imaginative prose which this period produced. His talent lay in writing allegory stories which a double meaning, which where characters are named according to the certain properties which they possess. This as in the flattery as persons. Besides vivid imagination, Bunyan shows strong dramatic power. His language is earnest and simple, and was formed from reading the Bible, which he knew almost by heart. He wrote several other books besides Pilgrim's Progress, namely The Life and Deeds of Mr. Badman and the Holy War. But his fame rests on Pilgrim's Progress, which is greatest prose allegory in the English language. Bunyan's writings are the result of genius. The second author is John Dryden, was the son of a clergyman, had a university education, and made up his mind to earn his livelihood by writing. He forms a connecting link between the age of Puritan influence and the age of Restoration. He devoted his whole life to literature and became the acknowledged literary leader of the time. His poetry, Dryden's greatest poem, is satire called Absalom and Achitophel, and these names from the Bible to prominent political leaders of the day. The Earl of the Shaftesbury and the Duke of Monmouth satirized their friends, and associates also come in for a share of showing of character and situation and for keenness of attack on individuals. This poem ranks first among English political satires. Here given John Dryden's work, Absalom and Achitophel, its book version. Dryden has been called the greatest poet that ever was or could be made wholly out of prose. He delighted to argue in verse. Dryden was poet laureate from 1670 to 1688. Dear students, thank you for your attention. See you in the next lessons.